"Those shoes belong in a museum," Peter roared, raising his wineglass like a dagger. The whole room erupted. Laughter, smirks, even Clara hiding a chuckle. My son had just turned 30 years of work, sacrifice and fatherhood into a punchline. But it got worse. When the crowd turned away, I caught Clara's eyes, and for just a second her perfect smile cracked. That's when I knew. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was scared. And not of me, of Peter. She pulled me aside, voice barely a whisper. "There's something you should know about the money." He mocked my shoes in front of his empire, but he didn't know I'd built my life to last. I kept my mouth shut that night, but I didn't walk away empty-handed. My name is Walter McAllister, and I'm 75 years old. Each morning I still open my small carpentry shop, the one I built with decades of careful hands and honest work. My son Peter, now a corporate executive, traded sawdust for silk ties and corner offices, leaving behind the values that once shaped him. The steam from my morning coffee mingles with cedar dust, while my old leather shoes creak against worn floorboards. These same shoes that carried me through the lean winters when I raised him alone. Peter's world revolves around status now. He sees my weathered hands and modest shop as relics. But what he doesn't know is that I kept every ledger balanced, every number true, my carpenter's eye trained to spot the smallest flaw in both wood and wealth. Tomorrow night's dinner at his mansion looms ahead. But let me start from the beginning. I pulled up to Peter's mansion just after sunset, my old Chevy looking like a work truck among the gleaming German sedans. The bottle rack I'd made him sat wrapped on the passenger seat, quarter-sawn oak with brass fittings, the kind of piece that takes time to get right. You know the type. Every joint hand-cut, every corner square as truth. The front walk stretched longer than my whole workshop, lined with those little ground lights that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. My shoes, comfortable as an old friend, made that familiar leather creak with each step. 30 years of standing at my bench had worn them just right, like they'd grown to know my feet. The door opened before I could knock, and there stood Peter's housekeeper, because heaven forbid my son should answer his own door. The marble foyer gleamed like wet ice, making me suddenly conscious of every scuff on my soles. Around me, conversations buzzed with designer names I'd never learned to pronounce right. Some woman near the stairs was actually showing off her shoes, balanced on one foot like a flamingo, while others cooed over the red soles. "Dad, you made it!" Peter's voice carried that public polish he'd perfected, the one that made everything sound like a performance. He crossed the room in what looked like $1,000 loafers, each step clicking precisely on his precious parquet floor. The hug was quick, more photograph than feeling. "Brought you something," I said, holding out the wrapped rack. "Made it in the shop." "How rustic." He set it aside without unwrapping it, already scanning the room for more important guests. "Get yourself a drink, mingle a bit. These are all key players from the firm." I took a glass of whatever was being passed and found a spot near the kitchen island where I could watch it all unfold. "You ever notice how some people move differently when they think they're being watched?" Peter was doing his host dance, gliding between clusters of executives and neighbors, laughing at jokes that couldn't possibly be that funny. Every now and then he'd glance my way with that look sons get when they're hoping their fathers won't embarrass them. The marble countertop felt cold under my fingers as I leaned there, watching. My right shoe had that familiar give at the toe, the leather loose from years of pressing against workbench footrests. The contrast between that honest wear and all this polished pretense made my throat tight. A young woman in heels that could double as weapons clicked past, whispering something about Ferragamo to her friend. I sipped my drink and thought about my first pair of work boots, bought with 2 weeks' wages back when Peter was still in diapers. Now here I stood, surrounded by people who probably spent more on their socks than I did on a week's groceries. The quiet tap of silver against crystal cut through the chatter. Peter had moved to the center of the room, wineglass raised, that showman's smile bright as stage lights. "Friends, colleagues, neighbors, thank you all for coming tonight." He paused, letting his gaze sweep the crowd like some politician at a fundraiser. "We have something special to celebrate." I felt it coming before it started, that shift in the air when a room turns into an arena. The conversations died down to whispers, then to silence. A chuckle drifted from someone near the bar, followed by that particular quiet that comes before a spectacle. Peter's eyes found mine across the room, glinting with something that wasn't quite kindness. His free hand gestured downward, drawing attention to the floor, to shoes, to mine. My old leather companion suddenly felt heavy as iron, rooting me to that spotless floor while every designer-clad foot in the room shifted my direction. Peter's smile stretched wider as he lifted his glass higher. "Speaking of vintage treasures," he announced, "Dad, those shoes of yours, I think they belong in a museum. What do you say, folks? The Smithsonian's ancient footwear collection." The laughter hit like hammer blows against the marble walls. Sharp, cruel sounds that bounced off expensive artwork and designer outfits, multiplying until the room seemed full of it. I'd heard quieter echoes in empty churches. You know that feeling when time slows down, when every detail burns itself into your memory whether you want it or not. I could see every face in that crowd. Some tried to hide their smirks behind wine glasses. Others grinned openly, eager to join the fun at the old man's expense. A few looked away, probably remembering their own father's worn shoes. The heat started at my collar and crawled up my neck like poison ivy. These shoes had carried me through 3 decades of 12-hour days, through sawdust and wood shavings, through lean times when new boots meant no meat on the table. Now they were just props in my son's comedy show. Words rose in my throat, sharp, splintery words that could have turned this fancy party into kindling. But I'd learned long ago that some wood's too warped to straighten, so I swallowed them back, bitter as brass shavings. That's when I noticed Clara, Peter's wife, standing near the kitchen arch. Most folks might have missed it, but I've spent a lifetime reading grain patterns in wood. You learn to spot what others don't. Her perfectly made-up face had cracked for just a second, a flinch quick as a chisel slip, before she smoothed it over. But her eyes, they went from bright to shadowed like sunshine dying on varnish. I set my bottle rack down on that cold marble counter, making sure my hands didn't shake. 30 years of precision cuts teaches you steadiness, even when your insides are rattling like loose boards in a storm. The handmade piece looked strange there, honest wood among all that stone and crystal. The laughter was fading now, dissolving into the clink of expensive glasses and the buzz of resumed conversations. People drifted back to their circles, probably already forgetting the old carpenter and his museum-worthy shoes. But I felt each scuff on my soles like a battle scar, each crack in the leather like a chapter in a book these people wouldn't understand. Clara moved then, crossing the floor with that careful grace rich women learn. Her hand, all manicured nails and diamond rings, touched my sleeve light as sawdust settling. "Walter," she said, soft enough that only I could hear, "meet me by the back hallway in 5 minutes. Please." Her eyes darted toward the crowd, then back to mine. Something in them had dimmed, like she was carrying a weight heavier than all her jewelry. I've always believed you can learn a lot about people by watching how they handle tools. Some grip too tight, fighting the wood instead of working with it. Others hold too loose, letting the blade wander where it shouldn't. Clara's touch on my arm was like a master craftsman's, deliberate, measured, hiding purpose behind politeness. The party swirled. Around us, guests laughing and chattering while Peter held court near the windows. He'd already moved on to some story about his latest business triumph, his voice carrying across the room like he was trying to fill every corner with his importance. Clara's fingers slipped from my sleeve, and she drifted away toward the back of the house. I stood there, feeling the honest leather under my feet, remembering how many floors these shoes had crossed. Workshop floors scattered with sawdust and possibility, hospital floors the night Peter was born, kitchen floors during midnight feedings when it was just him and me. Now here we were, on floors that cost more than my first house, and somehow we'd never stood further apart. Following Clara down that hallway felt like walking through one of those fancy galleries. You know the type, where everything's arranged just so. Diplomas marched along the walls in perfect formation, each frame catching light like Peter was collecting gold medals. Harvard Business School, finance certificates, awards from groups with names longer than lumber orders. A catering girl ghosted past with empty champagne flutes, her shoes whisper quiet on the thick carpet. Different from the squeaky tiles in my shop's break room, where we used to share coffee and job plans before the work dried up. Clara stopped near a dark wooden sideboard, smoothing her dress with hands that didn't quite stay still. "Walter," she said, and her voice had that careful quality people use when they're testing ice thickness. "There's something you should know about Peter." My son's name in her mouth sounded different than it had in the living room. Less shine, more shadow, like when you flip a board over and find rot hiding under the polish. "He's not—" She glanced back toward the party noise, then leaned closer. "He's not what everyone in there thinks. There are secrets, financial ones. You ever have a moment when the ground seems to shift under your feet? Like someone just told you the level you've been using all these years was off? That's how those words hit me. Financial secrets, from my son, who'd always preached about honest numbers and clean books. "What kind of secrets?" I kept my voice steady, the way you do when you're checking a cut that might have gone wrong. Clara's perfume smelled expensive, but her next whisper came cheap and desperate. The kind that could ruin everything if anyone looked close enough. Hidden in plain sight, like... Another server drifted by and she pressed her lips together until we were alone again. I wanted to grab her shoulders, shake loose the rest of that sentence. But you don't survive 40 years to have detailed woodwork without learning patience. So I waited, watching her face like I'd watch for grain patterns in raw timber. "I shouldn't say more," she finally managed. "Not here. But watch the signs, Walter. They're there if you know where to look." The party noise swelled suddenly. Someone must have opened the door to our quiet corridor. Clara straightened up like a startled deer, patted my arm once, and slipped away toward the sound of crystal and success. I stood there another minute, letting her words settle like sawdust after a cut. Then I walked back into that bright room where everyone was still playing their parts. Peter at the center, Clara at his side, guests orbiting them like planets around twin suns. Some young fellow I didn't know helped me with my coat, probably thought he was doing the old man a favor. I let him think that. Sometimes being underestimated is better than being watched. Outside, the night air hit my face like a cold chisel. My eyes were damp from the wind, I told myself, though there wasn't much breeze. The driver Peter had sent couldn't have Dad taking a bus to his fancy party, opened the car door without a word. Good man. He knew when silence was worth more than small talk. I watched streetlights slide across the window like shooting stars, each one drawing a bright line between then and now, between the father who taught his boy to measure twice and cut once, and whatever Peter had become while I wasn't looking. The shop was dark when I got home, just like I'd left it. One bulb still worked over the main bench. I keep meaning to replace the others, but somehow never get around to it. Funny how you can get used to working in shadows. I stood there under that single light, staring down at these old shoes that had carried me through the evening. Through decades of standing at this bench, through raising a son alone after his mother passed. The leather was cracked but honest, like the calluses on my hands, like the numbers in my books. Hidden in plain sight, I repeated Clara's words to the quiet shop. Tools threw strange shadows on the walls. A half-finished cabinet sat patient in the corner, waiting for morning. What makes a woman pull her father-in-law aside during a party to whisper warnings about her husband? What makes her risk everything to plant seeds of doubt in soil she can't be sure will grow them? The next afternoon, I met Clara at some artsy cafe downtown where they served coffee in bowls instead of cups. Not my usual spot. Give me a diner counter any day, but she'd picked it for the privacy. Steam from our drinks fogged up the windows, turning the outside world into watercolor smudges. You know that feeling when you're about to hear something you can't unknow? Like the crack of wood splitting wrong? When you're already committed to the cut. That's how it felt watching Clara arrange sugar packets into neat rows, avoiding my eyes. "Peter," she stopped, rearranged the packets again. "He's been taking money from my family's trust. A lot of money." My coffee went bitter in my mouth. "Taking how?" "False accounts. Shell companies with innocent-sounding names, like Pioneer Consulting and Heritage Management. They look legitimate on paper, but they're empty. Just vessels." Her voice cracked on that last word. "He's been using them to siphon funds, small amounts at first, then larger ones, always careful to stay just under the audit thresholds. I'd taught Peter his numbers on our shop floor, counting board feet and calculating angles. Now he was using that same head for mathematics to strip his wife's family bare. My stomach rolled like I'd breathed in too much sawdust. "How long?" I managed. 2 years, maybe 3. I started noticing discrepancies in the quarterly reports, but he always had explanations. Investment strategies, market fluctuations. Clara's laugh came out hollow. I wanted to believe him. God, I sound so stupid. You're not stupid, I said. Trust isn't stupid. The steam from my coffee bowl made ghosts on the window. Beyond the glass, people hurried past, wrapped up in their own stories. Inside my head, two voices argued. The father who'd bandaged Peter's skinned knees, and the craftsman who'd always preached that bad joints fail under pressure. Why tell me? I asked finally. Why not go straight to the authorities? Clara's fingers worried at a napkin corner. Because you're his father. Because maybe you can, I don't know, reach him. Stop him before it gets worse? She swallowed hard. And because my family, we're not just numbers in a ledger. That money was meant for my sister's medical care, my parents' retirement, real people, real consequences. My boy had turned marriage into mathematics, family into figures. The carpenter in me knew what happens to structures built on rot. They collapse, taking down everything connected to them. I'll look, I heard myself say, not to destroy him. But this needs to stop. Relief softened Clara's face. She reached into her designer bag, the kind that probably cost more than my whole tool collection, and pulled out a thin manila folder, pushed it across the table like it might burn her fingers. Bank statements, transaction dates, company names. Her voice dropped lower. And this, she flipped to the last page, where a calendar showed dates circled in angry red ink. This is when everything moves offshore. After that, it's gone for good. I studied those circles, thinking about time and timing, about how long it takes to build something solid and how fast the wrong cut can bring it all down. Peter's always been... Clara paused, searching for words. He measures everything by numbers, success, status, worth, even people, even you. That last bit stung, but truth often does, like getting solvent in a fresh cut. I closed the folder, kept my hand flat on top of it. Through the fogged window, those watercolor people kept rushing past, while inside, my world had tilted on its axis. The coffee in my bowl had gone cold, untouched. Thank you, Clara said softly, for listening, for being willing to look. I nodded, not trusting my voice just then. The folder felt heavy under my palm, weighted with more than paper. Weighted with choices no father should have to make. 3 days after the cafe, Clara pulled up to my shop in one of those whisper-quiet hybrid cars. I'd cleared the back office. Well, what I called an office. Really just a corner where I kept the books, backing up to old growth pine walls that had witnessed 40 years of calculations. It's not exactly your marble counters, I said, gesturing to the scarred workbench I'd dragged in. But Clara just smiled, setting down her leather briefcase like it belonged there between the sawdust and pencil shavings. It's perfect, she said. Nobody would think to look here. You ever notice how numbers have their own kind of poetry? Not the flowery kind, more like a story told in Morse code. Dot, dash pattern. I'd spent decades measuring twice, cutting once, and now those same careful eyes were scanning bank statements instead of board edges. We spread the papers across that old bench, its surface worn smooth by countless blueprints and invoices. Clara had brought fresh statements, more pieces to our growing puzzle. The familiar banks jumped out first: Midwest Regional, First State, Commerce Trust. But it was the unfamiliar names that made my pencil pause. Pioneer Consulting, I read aloud, tapping the eraser against a line item. First payment, same week your trust made its quarterly distribution. Clara nodded, her manicured finger tracing down to the amount. Always just under 50,000, the trust's automatic review threshold. My boy had learned his lessons well. Too well. I remembered teaching him fractions using wood scraps, watching his quick mind grasp the relationships. Now he was using that same precision to craft something else entirely. Look here, I said, sliding 2 statements side by side. Pioneer's address resolves to a UPS store in the business district. And this one, I pointed to Heritage Management, uses one of those corporate agent services. Ghost addresses for ghost companies. You know that feeling when you're working a complex joint and suddenly see how all the angles line up? That's how it felt as the pattern emerged. Every Friday, round sums would flow into Pioneer. By Monday, they'd split 3 ways, smaller amounts, harder to track. I pulled out a fresh binder. Nothing fancy, just the kind you'd find at any office supply store. Started making tabs by month, by company name. My hands knew this kind of work, even if the material was different. Organization matters, whether you're tracking board feet or blood money. The humiliation from that party? It was fading, replaced by something steadier, colder. Numbers don't lie once you learn their language, and these numbers were telling quite a tale. "There," Clara said suddenly, her voice tight. She pointed to a transfer dating back 18 months. Heritage Management. They incorporated 2 weeks after Pioneer's first transaction. I reached for my red pencil, the same one I used to mark critical measurements on lumber. Circled both companies, drew a line between them like mapping joints on a blueprint. "Connected," I said. "One feeds the other." Clara's shoulders squared, just a fraction. "Funny how solving one piece of a puzzle can strengthen your spine. We need to follow Heritage's outflows next, see where that money goes." The shop's single overhead light cast everything in sharp relief. Papers, pencil marks, the determined set of Clara's jaw. Outside, the late afternoon sun played tricks with shadows through my dusty windows, but in here, everything was coming into focus. I studied these new pages, like I'd once studied grain, patterns, looking for hidden flaws that could compromise the whole structure. My boy had built himself quite a maze of money trails, but every maze has its solution if you're patient enough to map it. "Same time tomorrow?" Clara asked, carefully stacking our progress into her briefcase. I nodded, already thinking about the next layer we needed to peel back. "Bring Heritage's complete transaction history if you can get it. And Clara," she paused, at the door. "We're going to need a bigger binder." Next morning, Clara showed up right as I was unlocking the shop. She had that look people get when they haven't slept, the kind of tired that coffee can't fix. Can't say I blamed her. I'd spent half the night myself, lying awake, running numbers in my head like counting sheep. "I brought everything I could find on Heritage," she said, pulling out a fresh stack of papers. Her hands trembled slightly as she set them down, including their invoices. I cleared off my workbench, same way I'd done thousands of times before projects. Only instead of laying out chisels and planes, we were spreading paper trails and bank records. Funny how life throws you these curves. One day you're matching wood grain, the next you're matching money flows. "These invoices," I said, picking up one dated 3 months back. "Consulting services at 5,000 per day? For what exactly?" Clara's laugh was bitter. "Nothing, it's all fabricated. I found the template he uses. Standard corporate letterhead, vague service descriptions. Just enough detail to pass a casual review. We laid them out chronologically, creating a visual timeline. The pattern was even clearer now. Money in from Clara's trust, split between shell companies, disguised with fake invoices, then, well, that's where things got interesting. "Look at this," Clara said, sliding over a wire transfer form. My eyes caught on the routing details, some bank I'd never heard of in the Caymans. But it was the execution date that made my stomach drop. "Friday," I read aloud. "This Friday?" Clara nodded, her fingers drumming nervously on the bench. "There's a board audit that morning. They review all major transfers quarterly. Peter must think he's cutting it close." I finished. "Get the money out just before anyone might notice it's gone." I walked over to my shop calendar, the kind with big squares for noting delivery dates and client meetings. Picked up my heaviest pencil and wrote "Friday Audit" in block letters. Underlined it 3 times, each line deeper than the last. Somehow seeing it there made everything more real. "We need to be ready before then," I said, turning back to Clara. "What exactly do we have so far?" She reached for her briefcase again, pulled out a legal pad. "I've been keeping track. Bank statements showing the original transfers from my trust. Documentation on both shell companies, Pioneer and Heritage, the fake invoices, wire transfer instructions." She paused, checking items off with a pen. "And I've written out everything I know, had it notarized this morning." I studied her list, thinking like a carpenter planning a complex joint. Every piece had to fit perfectly, or the whole thing could fall apart. "There's something missing," I said slowly. "The wire instruction. Who authorized it?" "Peter did, through his work email." "We need that email," I said. "Without it, there's no direct link proving he's behind the transfer. Just circumstantial evidence." Clara's expression shifted, something between worry and determination. "He keeps his laptop at home, in his study." She glanced at her watch. "He has dinner with clients tonight. Won't be back until late. The implication hung in the air between us. You know those moments when you can feel the weight of a decision before you make it? This was one of those. I'd raised my boy to respect privacy, to never take what wasn't his. Now here I was, considering the opposite. Can you get into his email? I asked, keeping my voice steady. She nodded. I know his password. He uses the same one for everything. His college graduation year plus his first car's model. A small, sad smile touched her lips. He told me once he'd never forget either. I picked up my pencil again, added authorization email to our checklist. The lead broke under the pressure, leaving a dark smudge. What time does he leave for dinner? 6:30. He won't be home before 11. I checked my watch, just past 9 in the morning. The ticking seemed louder somehow, like time itself was counting down. We'll need to print it, I said. Forward it somewhere first, then print. Cover our tracks. Clara straightened up, smoothing her skirt with steady hands now. I can do it. Tonight. I'll bring the email first thing tomorrow. You ever notice how different a familiar street looks after dark? I sat in my old Buick, parked a block from Peter's mansion, and everything seemed strange. Like the shadows had rearranged the neighborhood into something I didn't quite recognize. Maybe that's what happens when you're about to cross a line you never thought you would. 10 minutes, Clara whispered, checking her phone one last time. That's all I need. I nodded, watching her slip out of the passenger seat. She moved like a ghost in that pale sweater of hers, crossing under streetlights that made everything too sharp and too soft at the same time. Reminded me of winter evenings in my shop, when the single bulb would cast doubles of every tool on the wall. The dashboard clock ticked past 9:30. I could see Peter's house from here, all lit up like a jewelry store display. Funny how a place can hold such different memories. Last time I'd been here, those lights had framed my humiliation. Now they were just keeping watch while we dug up truth. My phone buzzed. A text from Clara. In study, found tablet. I drummed my fingers on the steering wheel, remembering how these same hands once guided Peters on a lathe, teaching him that patience shapes better than force. What would that younger version of me think about tonight? About sitting in a dark car waiting to gather evidence against my own son? The phone lit up again. Forwarding email now. I opened my inbox, watched the spinning circle, and there it was. Peter's authorization for the wire transfer. Clear as daylight, his signature line at the bottom. The timestamp matched our timeline perfectly. Something cold settled in my chest as I read it twice, 3 times. My hands looked old in the dim light, spotted, weathered, marked by decades of honest work. They started trembling just a little, and for the first time since this began, I felt every one of my 75 years pressing down at once. Clara slipped back into the car 5 minutes later, but I barely noticed. I was still staring at those hands, wondering if they had any right to do what we were planning. Walter, she touched my arm gently. Are you all right? I let out a long breath that fogged the windshield. A father shouldn't have to do this, I said finally, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. Shouldn't have to be the one who... I couldn't finish. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that cut right through my doubt. You told me once that a craftsman fixes what breaks, even if the break bears his name. I looked at her sharply. I had said that years ago, when Peter first brought her to my shop. We'd been talking about restoring old furniture, how sometimes the hardest repairs were the ones closest to home. We don't have to be the ones who deliver it, she continued. The firm's anonymous tip line, they take documented evidence. Let the process work on its own. The process, not vengeance. Let the hammer fall where it should, guided by rules rather than revenge. There was something clean about that, something that felt more like justice than punishment. I nodded once, slowly but firmly. The trembling in my hands had stopped. The audit team gets it first thing Friday morning, I said. Anonymous, like you said. Let them do their job. Clara squeezed my arm once more before settling back in her seat. I started the engine, its familiar rumble somehow steadying. As we pulled away from the curb, I caught one last glimpse of Peter's house in the rearview mirror, all those lights burning against the dark, not knowing what morning would bring. I've always been an early riser, comes with decades of opening a shop before the rest of the world wakes up. But that Friday morning felt different. The darkness had weight to it, like those pre-dawn hours when you know a storm's coming. My office printer hummed at 4:30 a.m., spitting out page after page of what Peter probably thought would stay buried forever. Bank statements, transfer records, shell company registrations, each one telling its part of the story. Remember those old paper trails we used to keep before computers took over? This wasn't so different. Money always leaves, tracks digital or otherwise. The shop smelled like cedar dust and machine oil, same as always. Funny how normal everything can feel when you're about to change lives. I laid each document on my workbench in precise order, the way I'd arrange tools before a complex build. You ever notice how some tasks require that kind of meditation? That perfect sequence of steps? I slipped everything into a plain manila envelope. No labels, no return address. Just clean and professional, like any other business document. The cover sheet was simple. Exhibit numbers listed neat as columns in a ledger, and one line at the top. Please review before today's audit. My handwriting stayed steady. Years of marking precise measurements paid off, I suppose. The downtown streets were still quiet when I parked near Peter's firm at 6:45. Early workers hurried past with coffee cups, wrapped up against a wind that carried the first hint of rain. Those big glass towers always made me feel small, but not that morning. That morning I had purpose in my pocket. You know what's strange? The lobby felt exactly like my shop, all clean lines and careful angles, just dressed up in marble instead of wood. The security guard barely glanced up as I crossed to reception. Just another early delivery, nothing to see. "Good morning," I said to the young woman at the desk, kept my voice casual, like I was dropping off plans for a kitchen remodel. "This needs to go to the audit committee, please, for their meeting today." She nodded, already reaching for the envelope. "I'll make sure they get it. Simple as that." 30 years of Peter's scheming, reduced to a handoff that took less than 10 seconds. I walked out into the sharpening wind, my old shoes clicking against the polished floor one last time. I found a spot across the street where I could watch without being obvious. The envelope would have to travel up through the building's daily noise, past secretaries and mail rooms, competing with coffee runs and meeting schedules. Would it make it? Would someone notice that plain packet carried truth like dynamite? My phone showed 7:15. I pulled up the shop calendar, checked the audit time again. 2:00 p.m. Nearly 7 hours to wait. The wind picked up, pushing clouds across the sky that looked heavy with rain. I thought about Clara, probably awake by now, carrying her own weight of waiting. Years ago, when Peter was small, he'd watch me sand wood for hours. "How do you know when it's smooth enough?" he'd ask. I always told him the same thing. Patience reveals truth. You can't rush what needs to be perfect. Now I stood in that strengthening wind, watching windows light up floor by floor, wondering if I'd been patient enough, if I'd sanded this truth smooth enough to do its job. A few drops of rain hit the sidewalk. I turned up my collar, checked the time again, 7:30. The morning was waking up properly now, and somewhere in that tower, a plain envelope was making its way toward people who knew how to read its contents. I took one last look at those gleaming windows. Somewhere up there, behind all that glass and steel, Peter was probably settling into his morning routine, not knowing his carefully built walls were about to crack. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but all I felt was a strange, hollow kind of quiet. The rain started falling harder. I pulled my jacket closer and headed back to my car. Nothing left to do now but wait and let truth find its own level, like water always does. Back at the shop, I tried to lose myself in routine. You know how it is. When waiting gets too heavy, your hands need something solid to hold. I pulled out a maple plank I'd been saving for a special project, though God knows my mind wasn't on woodwork just then. The old Stanley plane felt right in my grip, familiar as a handshake. Ever notice how tools carry memory in their weight? This one had balanced in my palm through 3 decades of builds, its brass worn smooth by countless passes. I lined it up along the edge and let it sing. The blade whispered through wood, curling shavings that dropped like ribbons. You'd think I'd be too distracted for precision work, but sometimes it's the detailed tasks that steady you. Each pass had to be perfect. No tear out, no chatter, just clean strokes that left glass-smooth grain behind. Around 11, thunder started grumbling overhead. Made me think of that envelope, probably sitting in some neat stack in a conference room, somewhere up in Peter's tower. Funny how paper can look so innocent and carry such weight. Would they notice it right away? or would it wait until the last minute? Those audit fellows, I imagined them as careful men in pressed shirts, the type who'd appreciate clean numbers and clear evidence. The maple kept me honest while my mind wandered. Had to focus on the grain, read which way it flowed. One wrong angle and you'd gouge the surface. Kind of like life when you think about it. Haven't we all learned that lesson the hard way? The shop clock ticked past noon, then 1. Rain started picking up outside, drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. I caught myself reaching for the phone 3 times, wanting to check if anything had happened. But what good would that do? Anonymous had to stay anonymous. That was the whole point. During a break in the planing, I glanced down at my shoes. Dust had settled into the cracks, making them look even more worn than usual. Funny how I used to feel shame about those creases. Now they just looked like character to me. I grabbed my polished tin, the same one I'd had since Peter was in high school, and worked a little into the leather. Not to make them fancy, mind you, just to keep them honest. You ever notice how some actions become prayers? The slow circles of polishing, the way leather drinks, in oil. It's like telling your story through touch. These shoes had carried me through Peter's graduation, through slow years and lean winters, through his wedding to Clara. Now they'd carry me through whatever came next. The shop stayed quiet except for rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. Must have been about 2:30 when my phone buzzed against the workbench. Clara's text lit up the screen. Going home now to confront. 4 words. Just 4 words, but they changed the air in the room. I set the phone down like it might bite, stared at my reflection in the shop window. Rain traced patterns down the glass, distorting everything outside into watercolor smears. The plane sat half-finished on my workbench, maple shavings curled around it like question marks. I couldn't focus on edges anymore. Instead, I found myself studying that door, the one that opened onto the street where I'd taught Peter to ride his bike. Where was that boy now in the man who'd turned marriage into math? Thunder cracked closer this time. The shop lights flickered once, like they were nervous too. I picked up my rag, wiped dust from my hands, and waited. Some moments you can't plane smooth or polish bright. Some moments you just have to let be what they're going to be. The rain kept falling, but I couldn't stay in the shop anymore. Needed to move. To breathe. I locked up and walked down to Bernie's Diner on the corner, same place I'd taken Peter for breakfast when he was small enough to need 2 phone books to reach the counter. Remember those days? When problems could be fixed with pancakes and a father's promise? I slid into my usual booth by the window, ordered coffee I didn't want, and set my phone on the scratched Formica. The screen stayed dark for what felt like hours, but was probably 15 minutes. Martha, the waitress who'd known me since her first shift decades ago, kept the coffee coming without asking. She knew that look, the one that says a man's waiting for news he might not want to hear. The first text from Clara came at 2:47. Just pulled in. Housekeeper's gone for the day. My coffee had gone cold. I wrapped my hands around the mug anyway, needing something solid to hold. You ever notice how time stretches like taffy when you're waiting? Every car that passed through the rain-swept street could have been carrying board members to that audit meeting. Every shadow behind the diner's steamy windows might have been Peter, somehow knowing where to find me. In his office now, showing him everything. I could picture it clear as day. Clara standing there in that mahogany-lined room, probably still wearing her tailored suit from work, laying out papers like playing cards. The shell company diagrams we'd drawn up, bank statements with his signature, that damning authorization email that proved it wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. My phone buzzed again. He's saying it's a misunderstanding, trying to charm his way out. Typical Peter. He'd learned early that a smile and smooth words could polish rough edges, used to work on his teachers when homework went missing. Even worked on me sometimes, if I'm being honest. But numbers don't care about charm, do they? The next update made my stomach clench. Now he's angry. Says I betrayed him. Demanding time to fix this. I thought about responding with something fatherly. Something wise. But what can you say when your own son has turned marriage into mathematics? Instead, I typed the only truth that mattered. Stand firm. The board meets today. Then I set the phone down and motioned Martha for a fresh cup. The diner's clock ticked through 10 minutes of silence. Rain drummed against the window. A truck splashed through a puddle outside. I caught myself counting heartbeats, wondering if each pause meant victory or disaster. Then, Lawyers engaged. Assets freeze moving. 6 words that changed everything. I could see Peter in my mind, pacing those marble floors like some caged animal in an expensive suit. The same floors he'd mocked my shoes on. Somewhere in that mansion, a door probably slammed, his final punctuation mark on a marriage built on ledger tricks. Martha stopped by with the pot. "Everything okay, Walt? You're looking pale." "Just family business," I told her. And wasn't that the truth? Family business indeed. The rain kept falling outside Bernie's window, but it had changed somehow. Didn't sound like judgment anymore. Sounded more like, well, like spring cleaning, like nature washing things clean. My phone stayed quiet after that. No more updates needed. The machinery of consequences was already turning. Corporate lawyers don't mess around with fraud, and neither do trust attorneys when family money's been siphoned. Sometimes justice wears a suit too, doesn't it? I left enough cash on the table to cover the coffee and a good tip. Martha called out, "Take care of yourself, Walt," as I headed for the door. My old leather shoes squeaked a bit on the diner's linoleum, still damp from the rain earlier, still honest about who they were and what they'd seen. I'd barely made it back to the shop when Clara's text lit up my phone. "Emergency board meeting called. They're bringing him in now." My hands weren't as steady as I'd have liked, so I set the phone down on my workbench. You know that moment when you've committed to something big, and suddenly it all feels too real. That's where I was, standing in my shop with sawdust dancing in the afternoon light, wondering if I'd just blown up my own family. I could picture that boardroom clear as day. Probably one of those glass-walled affairs high up in their tower, with a view that made people feel important. They'd have that packet I'd delivered spread out on their polished table by now. Each exhibit numbered and tagged, just like I'd organized them. Neat, professional. The kind of work that says, "Take this seriously." The next message came quick. They're showing the authorization email on the projector. That email. The smoking gun, as they say in those crime shows Peter used to watch. His digital signature right there at the bottom, authorizing transfers that didn't match any legitimate business. Hard to talk your way around something like that when it's 10 feet tall on a wall. Remember, when Peter was 12, he came home crying because some kids made fun of his second-hand baseball mitt. I stayed up all night oiling that leather, working it soft, showing him how to care for things properly. Value isn't in the price tag, I told him. It's in how you treat what you've got. Somewhere along the way he'd forgotten that lesson. Another buzz. Board deliberating now. Council present. HR waiting outside. HR waiting outside. 3 words that spelled the end of everything Peter had built his identity around. Funny how a career can fold up as neat as a cardboard box, ready to be carried out under security escort. Though I suppose there's nothing funny about it, really. The weight of it all hit me then, right there between the table saw and the lathe. My knees weren't what they used to be, so I gripped the workbench edge, had to remind myself to breathe. You raise a child, hoping they'll grow into someone you can be proud of. Someone who understands that character matters more than credit cards. Where had I gone wrong? A car door slammed somewhere on the street. My heart jumped. Would Peter come here? Would he storm in, all righteous anger and expensive cologne? Or would he do what he did when he was small, after skinning his knee or breaking a window? Come looking for his dad to fix things. I reached for my shoes, sitting there on the bench where I'd left them. The leather was still warm from the polishing I'd given them earlier. Old habits, you know. When you're waiting on bad news, sometimes you fall back on familiar motions. I worked another dab of polish into the toe, watching the leather drink it in like it was thirsty. These shoes had seen every kind of day, good ones, bad ones, and now this one. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shop's sign. Somewhere in that downtown tower, men in better shoes than mine were deciding my son's fate. The same son who'd laughed at these old leather friends of mine. Life has a way of evening scores, doesn't it? Though I'd never wanted to be the one holding the calculator. Clara's next text landed like a hammer. Still in session. Legal team growing. Trust attorneys conferencing in. I set the polishing cloth down and looked around my shop. Tools hung in their proper places. Wood stacked neat and true. Everything in its right spot. A life built on straight lines and square corners. Maybe that's why Peter's crooked math had hit me so hard. It went against everything I'd tried to teach him about honest work and true measure. The wind gusted again, stronger this time. Papers rustled on my desk, estimates for honest work, invoices for true materials. I waited for the next message, for whatever verdict was riding that wind toward us all. I couldn't stay in the shop any longer. The walls felt too close, like they were holding their breath. Had to see it for myself, you know. So I locked up and headed over to Peter's Street, just as the sun was setting. The whole scene hit different in that purple dusk light, made everything feel like some kind of stage play about to wrap its final act. I'd walked these sidewalks before, but never with such heavy steps. You ever notice how a neighborhood changes when something big happens, like it can smell the drama? Cars moved slower, curtains twitched, even the birds seemed to hush up. First thing I spotted was this cluster of suits pouring out of the front gate. Must have been 6, maybe 7 executives, all trying their best to look like they were just heading home after a normal day. But I knew better. Their faces had that careful, blank look people get when they're carrying bad news in their briefcases. One of them actually checked his watch 3 times while waiting for his driver. Nervous tick, probably. My phone buzzed. Clara's message was short and final. Board unanimous. Terminated for cause. Just like that. 20 years of climbing corporate ladders swept away in one afternoon. The phone buzzed again before I could even pocket it. Court order granted. Accounts frozen. Double. Hammerfall. Not just his job gone, but every penny locked up tight. All those shell companies he'd built, all those hidden accounts, frozen solid now. Funny how money can disappear faster than it takes to earn it. Through the iron gates, I caught movement in the big front windows. Clara's shadow passed back and forth, then paused. A suitcase appeared. One of those expensive rolling ones Peter had bragged about last Christmas. The kind with a name I couldn't pronounce. It glided across that marble floor he'd been so proud of, smooth as silk on ice. The front door opened, spilling warm light onto the steps. Clara stepped out, pulled the handle up on her suitcase, and didn't look back as she closed that heavy door behind her. The sound echoed off the stone facade like a judge's gavel. Just like that, marriage done, frozen assets, career in ashes. Amazing how fast a life can unravel when truth pulls the right thread. I waited until Clara's car disappeared around the corner. Then I took my time walking past the front gate. My old leather shoes, freshly polished that afternoon, clicked against the pavement with each step. Solid sound, honest sound. The kind of sound that says here walks a man who knows exactly who he is. The marble steps caught the last light of day, making them shine like mirrors. I stopped there for a moment right by the gate. Looking down, I could see my reflection in that polished stone, these weathered shoes of mine throwing back the evening light, my own straight stance rising above them. Funny thing about reflections, they show you exactly what's there. No more, no less. In that marble mirror, I saw myself standing taller than this whole mansion that had once made me feel small. These shoes that had been mocked now gleamed against stone that cost more than my whole shop. But they were still standing, still carrying me forward, just like always. The words came natural then, quiet but clear in the evening air. Respect outlasts riches every time.